Hello everybody and welcome to another game design video, and this is the fourth in the series of ways we could expand or alter or think about changes going forward in Age of Sigmar. As we, sort of are coming up to the release of the General's Handbook 2, depending on when you're listening to this, it got me thinking about ways that we can talk about balance, because the most common sort of discussion around the General's Handbook 2, and sort of the thing that there tends to be a lot of internet wank about in general, is balance and balancing units and are things pointed correctly and blah, blah, blah. That discussion just happens all the time, okay? And I don't have a problem with that discussion per se. My issue with it is that discussion is too simplistic and doesn't really take into account the way that we deal with the game on a go-forward basis, and it artificially limits our options. So, let's get into it, and I'm going to walk you through how I perceive balance, and we'll see if, as always, if I can bring you along with me. So let's talk about the basics. As I mentioned, when we talk about balance, whether it's units, forces, whatever, we talk in the simplest terms. This isn't balanced against that. Or it's often too, like, now efficiency has become a popular word. It's too efficient for its what? Its points. That's right. And the problem with this sort of discussion is that right away it assumes that there is a sort of way that you can calculate this out. So what I mean by that is, and the problem is it's usually defined in terms of killing. We've made a lot of progress in having scenarios where killing doesn't matter very much, but it's still a big part of the game, and so everything tends to boil down to that, even though obviously there's a lot of other things going on in a good scenario. In my schemes video, I talked about ways we can really upend that entire paradigm. But the problem with talking about points is that, one, as I mentioned, it's overtly simple. Yes, it is the main tool that was put there to determine, how effective a unit can be. But exactly how points are created is obviously as much art as science. I'm going to disabuse you of a notion right now. There is no mathematical formula you can put on a unit that will accurately represent its points. There's always going to be situations where it performs better and situations where it performs worse based on the matchup, the rest of the army composition, the synergy, the scenario. There are too many variables for this to calculate to a single answer. That is not how the equation works. Okay? Now you can get close, and you can have things that are way wrong because they're just too outside the park, but it's always going to be a bit of a gray line. Okay? Let's talk about the pros of adjusting points. The pros of adjusting points is that it creates an immediate sense of adjustment. This thing costs 100, now it costs 200. It has become twice as expensive of a resource in the opportunity cost calculations of the game. That's a real, tangible effect. Okay, as I say here, it's a hard effect. Like, you don't get to play with that. It just does what it does now, all the time. It is that, right? When you take it, if you're using points, it is now that, period. Okay? And I would also state that points are put in there as a balancing mechanic. That's the only reason they exist in the first place. They have no value on their own in the void outside of in comparison to all the other points in the game, right? You're not pointing at some sort of universal measure here. So they're only relevant when placed against each other. So adjusting the points makes sense. And again, I don't want this to come off as though I'm against the idea of changing points. I'm completely for that. I want to be very clear about that. I am pro changing points when they are way out of whack. But there are cons to changing points, and we need to be aware of them. The cons are that it devalues your investment in your army often. Or, because not always, but often these shifts are points up. Things that were too efficient get, less efficient, so their points go up. That's not always the case. Recently we had like the Fire Slayers get almost universally moved down in the experimental rules that were put out in advance of GHB2. But for the most part, it takes something you had that you were happy about, that you felt good about, that you liked how it performed, and it makes it do worse. Now, sometimes that might be necessary. There are things that are just game-breaking or bad, or, that just make the game more negative than what they add to it by existing at that value. Okay? But here's the other trick. This has a disproportional effect on casual players, especially when those casual players aren't building super optimized synergistic lists. Most often, these sorts of things happen because of bad combinations. When you take A, which is too efficient on its own but not game-breaking, and then you combine it with B, C, and D, now it goes off the rails, right? That's usually where this really gets the case. Like, Sail might be too cheap at his points cost, but Sail in the Void, Sail the Faithless, isn't broken in and of himself, right? It isn't that he does anything. He, by necessity, needs another unit he can throw forward. So the combination of Sail with other units to do, often it can be things like Bloodletter Bombs or something, another too efficient unit. When you start combining outliers, right, that's where you get critical mass and the problem becomes serious. But notice, casual players who probably don't combine all of these things in the absolute best case every time are still going to pay those higher points when they're running, lists that are less tuned, or just because they're fun, or because they happen to like Snake Surfers, or whatever, right? They are also going to feel that effect. The other thing I would say about points that I don't have here in my cons, but that is relevant more to the broader idea of using this as your main and only mechanism, is that it creates a treadmill of sort of points go up, points maybe rarely go down, everything's always chasing after everything else, and it's this sort of constant flux. It's fine if you're doing it around the edges. Sort of folding back the creases on the worst offenders and those sorts of things. Great. Good stuff. Good choice. But when it starts to become large swaths and it happens on the reg, then you can get churn. You increase your churn because people get frustrated at the toys that they want to play with and weren't necessarily abusing suddenly becoming less valuable. Okay? So, my main premise here from this point on is going to be we should use point adjustments where necessary, but we should always be cautious about it. And we should think about what else can we do that pushes the meta around and that also are additional tools for balance, whatever that means. That is to say, whatever it means to be running some kind of balanced force in a game where what you're staring down on the opposite side can be wildly different every time, and the scenario you're playing can have completely disparate goals game to game. So what are those additional tools? Well, maybe the most obvious is we could introduce entire new sub-factions, right? So, right here, I've got my little favorite sub-faction that I want to see devoted, and we're going to come back to them again later. But this isn't really a new sub-faction, but you can either build out an existing one. I picked on the devoted here because they're sort of a weak sub-faction right now. They have, 4 units, and they don't really work super great together. They're okay, I guess, maybe in a weird case, but they're just whatever. They're not good. And that's a shame, because I love the idea, and I love all these models. I love Flagellants, and I love the War Altar, and Witch Hunters, and Warrior Priests. These are, some of my favorite units this game has ever produced. So you can make either cut from whole cloth new sub-factions, i.e. let's introduce Fishmen. You can add to existing sub-factions with massive build-outs, i.e. Ironjaws, right, where we took the Ard Boys, which were an existing unit of Blackworks, and we built a whole thing around them, right? And that can truly change the meta, because these new forces bring a suite of new capabilities, and all of a sudden you've got, a completely different world people are living in. Things that might have been really good in Situation A, because this new army has become popular, are no longer as good, so an easy example would be, let's say, high armor is really popular in the meta, and then a really powerful glass cannon force is introduced. Well, if you were relying on your army having low attack number but high rend units, that's going to be way less useful against against high mass troops running around in t-shirts, right? Who are just going to swarm and beat that model down. One other point I'll say here is that this could also include moving or splitting forces between alliances. This is an interesting idea. I think we haven't seen it all yet, but it's certainly something that could be done. Here's a low-hanging fruit example that my co-host on Warhammer Weekly, Tom, has mentioned, which is we've got the Aolves right now, and we know that like Malarian is hanging around, and that there's these weird dark elves or something who live on the plane of shadow, Lugu, whatever, however you say it, and they could suddenly join death, right? Because you could have a new build out or some kind of split where some part of the force joins death. If you don't like that particular example, pick whatever you want. A re-release of Tomb Kings that joins Order, or Beastmen joining Destruction. Okay, like I don't want you to get hung up on the specific example if it offends your sensibilities of the narrative. My point is simply to talk about it in generic terms, where moving those things over has a big old swing, because by moving them in a different alliance, they suddenly can partner with different models. They can be, they get access to different sort of, bigger abilities, different magic items, different combinations, and suddenly the world changes. That can really move the meta. So we might not have introduced any new models, but by simply splitting a force or moving people around in alliances, you could have huge shifts on the overall meta of the game. Okay? So what are the pros here? Well, when you do this, it really moves the needle, right? Because anything is possible. From, as I mentioned, a small build-out of an existing force with only a couple of additional models to whole cloth new armies. Here come the fishmen. Roll them in, right? Like, the sky is the limit here with this kind of a change, and it can be a huge deal and really, really change things. It's arguable how popular or powerful magic was under almost any circumstances. I would argue that an army of, from the recent Tzeentch book, it's pretty powerful. So it changed the importance of magic and or having counters against magic, right? But what are the cons? Well, the cons are fairly obvious. This has a high cost for both players and GW, right? Because they have to spend a lot of money to make these new things, whatever percentage of new is in this release. And we have to spend a lot of money to buy them. Now, I like buying new models. It's not a bad thing. If I see a new army that's awesome, I'm happy to drop the money for it. But there's still cost, and not everybody's going to be as happy. I also list penetration time because this doesn't move the meta very quickly. When an army comes out, most people don't start buying it and playing it en masse, or really figure out how to tune it up and make it hum for a little while. So this takes sort of at minimum months to really penetrate and for you to begin seeing it, especially if it's brand new, right? Like, yes, when Iron Jaws dropped that weekend, you saw tons of people posting on Twitter with boxes of Iron Jaws. But those, you can't just set your box on the table and be like, this has 10, this represents 10 brutes. You gotta take them out, cut them off, put them together, paint them up. So, there's lead time there. So, penetration time. Okay, let's talk about some other ideas. Individual unit. So, let's say you've got a problem like the Warrior Brotherhood where you've got, forces riding in on the lightning bolt and just teleporting in. Well, we've seen how that's going to be addressed through the Stormcast book, and that Warrior Brotherhood probably isn't going to survive, and that's fine. That's another way besides points you can adjust things in the game. You can just remove them. In the case of Battalions, where you're not removing models, you can just yank things out, because it doesn't... Removing a formation is a less impactful thing than removing a swath of models. But on the flip side, we can also correct problems through single unit or model releases. So if teleportation and these sorts of movement shenanigans are an issue, you could introduce a single unit or model release that blocks that teleportation, limits that teleportation, is a direct, hard counter to that thing. Okay? And this can be, it could be something, it can be soft or hard. Like that's to say, it can be straight prohibition, i.e. it prevents that thing from happening. Or it could be cost, right? It could make it so they have to, it's harder for it to happen, or they get, attacked, like the Griffhound's warning cry, where, like, somebody jumps in and then the hound barks and everything turns around and shoots. So you can have one unit, one model, it could be a single character or monster or something, that can be there and push the meta away from that thing, whatever it is, being an easy win, right? And the trick with that is, again, you don't need to do a lot. You only need this one model. Now, let's talk about how that actually boils out, okay? And I'll do that through the pros and cons. The pros is that because it's a single model, it's a low cost to adapt to and to adopt, right? By that I mean you go buy the one thing. Whether it be one new unit or one new model. In general, that's not a cost-prohibitive thing. Most of us are willing to go buy a new cool model. If it's one model for an army we love, I think most of us are happy when that release happens, right? Yay, it's a new toy to flesh out the army we already own and love. Sweet. In general, that's a good thing. Yes, there's a small monetary outlay there, but I think for the most part, people are, like, all right, I'm okay with that. But let's talk about the cons, because I think this is where you see the limitation of this. It is harder to move the meta in a significant way through this kind of a release. Yes, even if it's a hard counter, it's still hard to move the overall meta, because, one, it assumes that you have that army or want to play that army or alliance, right? So if you release a new Chaos character that really screws with, like, Stormcast teleportation mechanics, that's cool and fluffy, but it assumes that somebody's playing Chaos. Now, a hardcore tournament player will tend to stop bringing that particular list if they think there's a 1 in 5 chance they're going to run into that list. Because even if they steamroll, for the most part, or have 4 solid games, and then their 5th one they just zero out because that enemy list contains their hard counter, that means they're not taking that tournament. Like, you can't have, a 0 point on your record and win the tournament, right? And that's what that segment of hardcore players wants. They can't have a 0 game. So if the hard counter exists and there's a 1 in 5 chance you're going to run into it, it's a loss, right? So it disrupts that tournament strategy. The problem is, again, that isn't necessarily true on the individual level or in smaller metas, right? Lots of people who aren't as tourney focused won't run that, won't play that unit, so then it doesn't necessarily disrupt it. People still might play the very disruptive formations or units or broken things or whatever you want to call it, because they're not running into the hard counters as often. Okay, so the point is that there is a limitation to what you can do with this, but I think this is one of those tools that should be part of the mix. And that's ultimately what I really think is the take-home point I want to lock in your mind, is that no one of these is correct. All of these are correct. Like, we need to engage in a sort of full court press about this, because these also all have the function that they shift the meta around, right? And so hence make it so it's harder for one thing to just rise to the top and dominate and make the game unfun. A sort of churn in strategy or list building, as long as it's not hyper fast, keeps the game fresh. Okay? Alright. What else could we do? Well, battalions. Remember earlier I mentioned my little Devoted of Sigmar Pilgrimage of Wrath buddies? Well, that is, a formation, right? A battalion. And these are really, really an underrated, extremely potent tool for fixing the meta. Okay? Because I would argue that the Devoted are more or less unplayable without their battalion. And then the battalion still makes them, like, okay. At best. At best. So, but it does something. It does a lot. These are also fluffy. People love battalions because they're cool. They give you, they give you an idea of what a force can look like, but still allow for a fair amount of customization within it. Like, most aren't as absolutely locked in as this when you look at the new style of the sort of formations, battalions, mega battalions, right? When you look at those, what you see is there's usually a lot of flexibility in there, like of sort of bring any number of this or 0 to 4 of this or something like that, right? And those things can have special abilities that are locked and contained within the battalion that are also hard counters to popular, beardy, meta-dominating stuff, and they can just shut it off. So the pros. 0 cost for the player, right? I mean, yes, maybe you've got to buy an additional unit or something for if you don't have the exact models to form to create the battalion. But if you've got a healthy selection of an army that a new battalion is released for, you probably / maybe already have that thing, at which point it's 0 cost to adopt. It's a low cost for GW. It's to do the design work. You have a couple people on staff who are sitting around dedicated to design. They can design this out. You put some art resources behind it. That's why I didn't say 0 cost for them. It's not. Like, they have to pay money for this. You have to pay people to do all this, the art, the text, the review, the editing, like everything costs money. Okay? But it's still low. You're not spinning up molds. Let's be fair here. Okay? And it's not like you're even printing books because you can release these digitally. And it does spur investment in additional models, because if it is a great battalion, especially if it's a sort of open-ended one, as I mentioned, like 0 to 8 of this or any number of that, well, then it can spur additional investment by the players who may already fulfill the battalion, but want to take the battalion to the next level. So they get a rewarding sense of having their army that they love now function better, and they're able to build it out in a more compelling way, right? It creates additional ways to play. It invigorates that existing force. This is the most important pro to me. You can have an army that maybe isn't that compelling, or a grouping that maybe isn't that compelling. It could be like the Devoted, it could be like Slaanesh, it could be people like this, where they're just kind of like a little more flat and not as many units. But then you release a battalion. Maybe it contains some of those units and stuff from other sub-factions, but they all work together harmoniously. Maybe it gives new cool special rules that really set them aside or feel unique. Maybe. There's a ton of different things you can do here. And every one of those things is a complete invigoration of that existing force and the way that force plays with, as I said, low to no cost. This is, to me, the thing we need to look at the most, because it is the least utilized, like, sort of standalone release element that could be happening that can quickly shift the meta around. And by the way, these could start being included and pointed in books and stuff like that come out and then just uploaded. Okay? The fact that a lot of these sit behind paywalls, I don't love. I think these are such a critical part of the game and such a critical tool to balance. I want to see most of these come out from behind a paywall. There's too many books that now they've been spread in, and frankly, I want to see them. I want to see pointed battalions spread in more. I can't afford to buy every silly book that comes out. But I want the battalions, and I want them in my app. So let's give them to me. How about that? Okay. There's I want to give my money to the company. I just want to give it to the company for things I want to buy. I'm more than willing to invest in stuff. I'm not comfortable investing in a large book, which is 98% useless to me, to get the 2 pages of rules I want. That's a bad play. What are the cons? Well, the cons are largely related to what I just said. These things have a low penetration because they often are hidden in books, hidden behind paywall, stuff like that. Now, if that's fixed, they still have a lower penetration because it requires people to go dig, right, and look and see what these things are, what's out there, what can I find, what can I do, right? They require an investment, either in paying for the battalion itself or in additional models, right? And also, there is a sort of hidden con that we do have to be kind of careful how many of these we made. Like, don't get me wrong, I want to see more made and more in different types made, okay? But we do have to be somewhat careful with this, because this could go to 11 real fast and become just a nightmare, where there's, hundreds of battalions in different combinations, and then you just, actually getting your head around that. Never mind the balance nightmare. Let's just talk about the nightmare of, like, I am a player. I want to find the battalions for my particular slice of figs. I have to search through 200 battalions and think about unit combinations. It's just, no. So there is a line here, right? So we do need to be somewhat careful. That being said, to me, this is the current most underutilized tool. Okay? So what's my conclusion? Well, my conclusion is this. Changing points are far from the only thing we could be doing, and they're probably not the best thing we have available. We need to broaden our scope and concepts here in how we think about altering the meta, moving things around, balancing things out, whatever you want to call it. Okay? And, by the way, the sort of additional 3 I explored here, I don't think those are the only 3. If you've got other thoughts along those lines of how you could move stuff around, create balance, do stuff like that beyond what I've said, I'd love for you to drop them down in the comments. Please do. Because I'd love to have the discussion. But we need to make sure we're looking at all the options. And here's another important point. We need to make sure we're addressing this slowly and in ways that have the least or at least at the very minimum a mixed impact on the player base, while also allowing the company long-term success. That is to say, I don't expect them to do everything for absolute free. Once I bought one army, I accept that there may be additional investment, such as an additional version of the General's Handbook. Okay, cool. Great. But that needs to be, like, that is to say, when I say slowly, what I mean by that is you don't need to shotgun all of this on the reg. Like, we have a lack of deep statistical evidence about things in Warhammer, in Age of Sigmar, because there are not enough games where the results are recorded at a granular level. You would need a massive data set. So instead, we exchange accurate data for anecdote. And often that is not a great trade, right? Because what ends up happening is people say this thing is unbalanced, and then other people pick it up, and then it becomes a sort of internet snake eating its own tail, and the noise just echoes around in this chamber until it is be true. It sort of this internet's weird magic of making hollow or false claims true because of the echo chamber effect. I'm not saying that's always the case. Some things truly are broken, but some things get over-exaggerated too. So, and sort of lastly, we always need to be mindful of how these balance changes impact segments that just don't care about balance at a granular level. I.e., your very casual players who are playing perfectly balanced lists because they're not tuning for utter success. If you start knocking their points around and putting and doing changes that are going to make their game worse, who, by the way, are the majority of the gamers. The majority of people are not your hardest core tournament players looking to exploit every finely tuned, sort of most efficient list in the game. You're going to hurt those people. You're going to cut off your nose to spite your face. Let me say it that way. Okay? So chasing that dragon needs to be done with extreme care, because you don't want to ruin your relationship or people's fun for people who just don't have any real care about balance at this particular level, or don't run into these problems. You don't want to hurt their game just to make it better for the 5, 10, 20% that do, right? So that's what I would say. So there you go. That's my thoughts on how we can address balance and shift the meta around in Age of Sigmar going forward. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did like it, give it a like. As I said, throw your comments for other ideas you have down below, or what you think about these ideas that I talk through. Always love to have the discussion. Give it a subscribe for more game design, hobby cheating, and of course Warhammer Weekly. And as always, share it sharing is always the nicest thing you can do. I really deeply appreciate it when people share the videos. That is super awesome. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.